You ever seen a patch that makes a room go quiet? The question didn't come from anyone in particular, but it hung in the air like cigarette smoke, slow and heavy, as laughter rolled across the dim bar just outside Fort Bragg, where Delta operators unwound after long rotations and longer silences, where stories were currency and respect was measured in what you'd done, not what you wore, and tonight, in the far corner beneath a flickering neon beer sign, an old man sat alone, his back straight despite the years, a ceramic mug of black coffee untouched in front of him, his jacket plain except for one thing, a small, faded patch stitched just above the chest pocket, its threads worn thin, its symbol nearly erased by time, and yet somehow still there, still holding on, like it refused to be forgotten, and that was what caught Sergeant Mason Briggs' eye, not because it was impressive, but because it wasn't, because in a room full of sharp uniforms and modern insignia, that patch looked like it didn't belong, like it had wandered in from another era and hadn't gotten the message that things had changed. Briggs leaned back in his chair, boots hooked under the table, a half-smirk forming as he nudged the guy next to him, eyes locked on the old man. "You see that?" he muttered, loud enough for a few heads to turn, and just like that, attention shifted, subtle at first, then sharper, like a lens focusing, conversations dimmed, not stopped, but redirected. Curiosity always moved faster than respect in places like this. The old man didn't react, not when Briggs stood up, not when the scrape of his chair cut through the low hum of the bar, not even when he walked over and stopped just a few feet away, casting a shadow across the table. "Hey," Briggs said. Voice casual, almost friendly, but edged with something else, something testing. "Where'd you get that patch?" No answer, just the faint sound of the ceiling fan turning above, blades slicing through warm Carolina air. The old man's gaze stayed on the coffee, like the question hadn't been asked, like it didn't matter, and that, more than anything, made a few of the operators exchange glances, because silence like that wasn't confusion, it wasn't fear either, it was something heavier, something deliberate. Briggs chuckled under his breath, shifting his weight. "What, souvenir shop off post?" A couple of quiet laughs followed, not loud, not cruel, just enough to tilt the moment, to push it forward, and still, nothing. The old man's hand moved slightly, not defensive, not tense, just resting on the table like it had all the time in the world, like it had been here before, like it knew exactly how this would go. And across the room, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes noticed it, not the words, not the smirk, but the stillness, the kind that didn't match the setting, didn't match the man's age or his worn jacket or the cheap coffee in front of him. Something about it pulled at the back of his mind, like a half-remembered briefing or a story he couldn't quite place. Briggs took a step closer now, close enough to reach out, close enough to test the boundary, his fingers hovering just inches from that faded patch. "I'm just saying," he added, voice dropping, quieter, sharper. "Around here, that kind of thing's supposed to mean something," and for the first time, the old man's eyes lifted, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to meet his, pale blue, steady, and for a fraction of a second, the noise of the bar seemed to thin out, like the world itself leaned in to listen, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted, small, almost invisible, but enough that Reyes felt it from across the room, a subtle wrongness, like a piece of a puzzle set in the wrong place, and he couldn't explain it yet, couldn't name it, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't going to end the way Briggs thought it would. Briggs did not pull his hand back right away, not because he needed to prove anything, but because in his world hesitation meant weakness, and weakness was something you learned to erase early. So his fingers hovered there just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable, just long enough to show everyone watching that he was in control of it, that this was still his stage, his room, his rules. But the old man did not shift, did not lean away, did not even blink, and that was where the balance started to tilt in a way Briggs could not quite see yet, because there was no reaction to push against, no anger to feed, no fear to amplify, just that same quiet stillness that seemed to absorb everything around it, like sound disappearing into deep water. And somewhere behind him a chair creaked as one of the operators adjusted his posture, the casual energy in the room tightening by a fraction. Not enough to stop anything, but enough that people were paying closer attention. Now, measuring something they could not fully explain, Briggs let out a short breath through his nose, half amusement, half irritation, and finally let his fingers tap lightly against the edge of the patch, not aggressive, not forceful, just dismissive, like he was proving a point that only he understood. Feels like nothing, he said, glancing back at his team with a crooked grin. Looks like nothing too. A couple of them chuckled. But the sound was thinner now, less certain, because even they could feel it, that faint shift in the air that did not belong to jokes or bar noise or late-night bravado, and the old man's eyes followed the movement of Briggs' hand for the briefest second before returning to the coffee, but that second was enough for Reyes to catch it, enough for something in his memory to flicker again. A briefing room, a faded photograph pinned to a board, a symbol half worn away but still recognizable to the right set of eyes. He could not place it fully. Not yet, but it was close now, uncomfortably close, and he found himself standing without realizing it, his chair legs scraping softly against the floor as he took a step forward, not to intervene, not openly, but to get a better look, because instinct was telling him something important was sitting in that corner and everyone else was about to miss it. Briggs noticed the movement out of the corner of his eye and tilted his head slightly, still smiling, still playing it light, you know. Something, Reyes? He called over, tone easy, but with an edge that said stay out of it. Reyes did not answer right away, his gaze fixed on the stitching, on the way the thread had been reinforced by hand in places where modern patches never were, on the faint outline of a shape that had been intentionally worn down rather than naturally faded, and that detail alone sent a quiet signal through him, something deliberate, something hidden in plain sight, and before he could stop himself he said, low and careful, that is not standard issue. The words did not carry far, but they landed heavier than Briggs expected, because for the first time the script shifted away from him, away from the mockery and into something uncertain, something he did not control. Briggs gave a small laugh, sharper this time. Yeah, no kidding, he replied, but he pulled his hand back now, not fully retreating, just resetting, reassessing, because the room did not feel quite the same anymore, and the old man finally moved, not much, just enough to wrap his fingers around the coffee mug and lift it slightly, the ceramic making a soft sound against the table, steady, controlled, like everything else about him, and when he spoke, his voice was low, rough with age but clear, carrying just enough weight to cut through the space without effort. Some things are not meant to be recognized, he said, not looking at Briggs, not looking at anyone, just stating it like a fact that did not need to be defended, and the words settled over the room in a way no one quite knew how to respond to, because they were not a challenge, not a warning, but something older than both. And Reyes felt it lock into place in his mind, that missing piece finally aligning, his stomach tightening as realization crept in, slow and cold, because if he was right, then this was no ordinary patch, and more importantly, this was no ordinary man, and the mistake unfolding in front of him was already bigger than anyone in that room understood. Reyes did not move any closer after that, but his attention locked in completely, the noise of the bar fading into something distant and hollow as his mind worked through fragments that refused to stay buried, pieces of training briefings and half-heard conversations among senior operators who spoke in lowered voices about things that never made it into official records, things that existed in the space between acknowledgement and silence, and that patch, worn and almost erased, fit too well into that space, not as decoration but as something that had been deliberately reduced, as if recognition itself had once been a liability. Briggs, on the other hand, shifted his stance slightly, the humor still on his face but no longer effortless, because the old man's response had not given him anything to push against, and for someone used to controlling the rhythm of a room, that absence created a subtle imbalance. He crossed his arms now, leaning back just enough to reclaim distance without appearing to step away. Not meant to be recognized, he repeated, a faint edge creeping into his voice. That sounds like a story. A few of the operators glanced at each other again, waiting to see if the moment would turn back into something lighter, something safer, but it did not, because the old man did not respond immediately. Instead he took a slow sip of his coffee, the kind of unhurried movement that made time feel different, stretched, deliberate, like everything outside of it had to wait its turn, and when he set the mug down again, the soft ceramic tap seemed louder than it should have been. Stories are for people who need them, he said quietly, still not looking at Briggs. Some things are just carried. The words settled heavier this time, not philosophical, not dramatic, just final. And that finality was what Reyes felt the most, because it matched something he had only ever seen once before, years ago, when a retired operator had visited the base and spoken for less than 5 minutes before leaving behind a room full of seasoned soldiers who had nothing to say afterward, that same silence, that same weight, and now it was here again, sitting in front of him in the form of an old man with a forgotten patch. Reyes exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, but enough to steady himself as the realization sharpened further, the stitching, the wear pattern, the intentional fading, it all pointed in one direction, not to a unit that was famous, but to one that was never supposed to be, one that existed only in fragments and call signs, and if that was true, then the name attached to it would not appear in any system Briggs could pull up on his phone. Briggs tilted his head slightly, studying the old man more carefully now, the smirk fading into something more analytical, because beneath the calm there was a presence he could not ignore, something that did not match the simple jacket or the age or the quiet demeanor, something that felt trained, controlled, precise, carried. He said, softer now, almost thoughtful, but still testing, always testing, must have been a long time ago. The old man's eyes shifted again, meeting his just briefly, and in that glance there was no challenge, no need to assert anything, just a depth that made the question feel smaller than it had sounded. Long enough, he replied, and that was it, no elaboration, no correction, just enough to close the door without slamming it. And that was when Reyes knew he could not let this continue without understanding exactly what he was looking at, because the margin for error had already disappeared. He turned slightly, casual enough not to draw attention, but his hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing against his phone, not pulling it out yet, not making the call yet, because he needed one more confirmation, one more detail to anchor the instinct into certainty. And across the table, one of the operators who had been watching quietly leaned in just a fraction, eyes narrowing at the patch, as if trying to decode it on his own, the room holding in that strange between state where nothing had escalated but nothing had settled either, and right in the center of it, Thomas Cole sat unmoved, unchanged, as if the entire situation had already played out somewhere else long before any of them walked into that bar, and the outcome had never really been in question at all. Reyes let his fingers rest against the phone for a moment longer, not moving yet, because once he made that call there would be no pulling it back, and whatever this was would no longer stay contained inside the quiet tension of a bar after hours. It would become something official, something that reached beyond rank and routine, and he needed to be sure, absolutely sure. His eyes shifted again to the patch, tracing the faint outline that most would dismiss as damage, but now he could see the intention behind it, the way certain lines had been worn down more than others, the way the stitching reinforced only the edges that mattered. It was not random, it was controlled, like everything else about the man wearing it, and that realization pulled another fragment into place. A memory not from a briefing but from a passing comment made years ago by a senior chief who had said, almost offhand, that some units did not erase themselves from history, they simply stopped being visible, and when they did, they left behind markers only a few would ever recognize. Reyes felt a slow, steady pressure build in his chest as that thought settled, because if that was true, then this was not just a misunderstanding, this was a line being crossed without anyone realizing it. Briggs shifted again. The confidence still there but now sharpened by curiosity, because he could feel the change even if he could not define it. The room was no longer reacting to him the same way, the laughter had thinned, replaced by watchful silence, and that was not something he was used to losing. He glanced briefly at Reyes, catching the focus in his expression, and that alone was enough to push him further, not back. You talk like you have been somewhere, Briggs said, his tone quieter now, more direct. But I have never seen that patch on any roster, any archive, nothing. The statement was meant to anchor the conversation back in his control, in facts, in systems he trusted, but the old man did not respond right away. Instead his hand moved again, not to defend the patch, not to hide it, but simply to rest over it for a second, fingers brushing the fabric with a familiarity that spoke louder than any explanation, and in that small motion something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Because it was not protection, it was acknowledgement, like someone touching a name carved into stone, and when he finally spoke, his voice was even, steady, almost distant. That is because it was never meant to be kept, he said, and the words landed with a weight that made Briggs pause, not visibly. Not enough for anyone to call it out, but enough that the next response did not come as quickly as before. Across the room one of the operators leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he knew, but there was nothing to match it to, no file, no unit designation, no familiar reference point. Just a growing sense that something important was sitting right in front of them and none of them had the clearance to understand it. Reyes exhaled slowly and made his decision. His hand slipped fully into his pocket now, retrieving the phone with a movement that stayed low, controlled, shielded by his body as he turned slightly away from the table, not leaving, not drawing attention, just stepping into the edge of the moment. His thumb hovered over the screen for a fraction of a second before dialing a number he had not used in years, one he had kept out of habit more than expectation. The line rang once, twice, and then connected with a voice that was calm, measured, and immediately alert. Reyes lowered his tone, keeping it tight. "This is Staff Sergeant Reyes," he said. "I need a confirmation on a possible identifier." There was a brief pause on the other end, not confusion, not hesitation, just silence that carried weight. "Go ahead," the voice replied. Reyes glanced back toward the table, toward the old man who had not moved, who seemed completely unaffected by the invisible shift now unfolding around him, and then he said it, careful, deliberate, worn field patch, hand-stitched reinforcement, symbol partially removed, possible legacy unit, name associated could be Thomas Cole. The silence on the other end stretched longer this time, not empty, but processing, and when the voice returned it was different, sharper, lower. "Repeat the name." Reyes felt the confirmation settle even before he spoke again. "Thomas Cole," he said. And the response did not come immediately, but when it did, it carried a single question that changed everything. "Do you have a call sign?" And Reyes' eyes drifted once more to the patch, to the man, to the weight of something that had been carried far longer than anyone in that room had understood. And for the first time since this started, he realized that whatever answer came next was not going to stay quiet for much longer. Reyes did not answer immediately, and that hesitation alone carried more weight than anything he could have said, because the voice on the other end did not repeat the question, did not rush him, it simply waited, the kind of silence that assumed the answer mattered, that it would not be guessed or improvised, and Reyes knew that if he spoke too soon, if he filled that space without certainty, he could misread everything that was unfolding. His eyes remained fixed on Thomas Cole, studying him. Now with a level of attention that stripped away the surface, the age, the quiet presence, the ordinary jacket, and looked for something deeper, something that could confirm what instinct was already telling him, but Cole gave him nothing new, no hint, no signal, just that same controlled stillness, like a man who had spent a lifetime ensuring that nothing about him was easily read. And that was when Reyes realized the answer would not come from the man directly, it would come from what had already been left behind, the patch, the stitching, the way it had been altered not to display identity but to obscure it, to carry meaning without revealing it, and slowly, carefully, he brought the phone closer to his mouth, lowering his voice even further. "I do not have confirmation," he said, choosing precision over assumption, "but there is something about the patch, something deliberate, it looks like it was meant to be forgotten." The line stayed quiet for a moment, and then the voice returned, sharper now, more focused. "You said Thomas Cole." Reyes felt the shift again, the name carrying weight beyond the room, beyond the bar. "Yes," he replied, and then there was a pause, longer than before, followed by a single, controlled exhale on the other end, not surprise, not disbelief, but recognition, and that alone tightened something in Reyes' chest, because recognition without explanation meant one thing. The information existed, it was just not meant to be shared. "Listen carefully," the voice said, lower now, deliberate. "If that is who you think it is, you do not ask him for anything, you do not challenge him, and you do not escalate this in any visible way." Reyes swallowed slightly, his eyes flicking once more toward Briggs, who was still standing there, still holding on to the situation without realizing how far outside of it he had already stepped. "Then what do I do?" Reyes asked quietly, and the answer came without hesitation this time. "You wait." The word landed with finality, not passive, not uncertain, but strategic, like a move already set in motion somewhere else. Reyes held the phone for a second longer, as if expecting more, but the line ended there, clean, decisive, and when he lowered it back into his pocket, the world of the bar returned in full, the low hum of voices, the clink of glass, the faint hum of the overhead fan, but everything felt different now, sharper, like the air itself had shifted. Briggs exhaled slowly. running a hand along the back of his neck as he looked at Cole again, not mocking this time. Not fully respectful either, but searching, trying to recalibrate. "You got people watching you, old man," he said, not as a threat, but as an observation, something he was beginning to understand rather than control. Cole did not respond right away, his hand still resting lightly against the coffee mug, fingers steady, unshaken, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty as before. "People have always been watching," he said, and the simplicity of it removed any illusion that this was new, that this moment mattered more than others, because to him, it did not, and that realization settled over the room in a way that no one could quite shake. Reyes shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself closer now, not to intervene, but to be ready, because whatever was coming next was no longer a question of if, but when, and somewhere deep in that growing silence, beyond the reach of the bar, beyond the awareness of anyone except the few who knew what to look for, something had already been set in motion, something that would not arrive with noise or warning, but with a presence that changed everything the moment it entered the room. The minutes stretched. Without anyone realizing it, the kind of slow tension that did not spike or break but simply deepened, settling into the room like humidity before a storm, and Briggs felt it more than anyone, not because he understood it, but because he could no longer control it. His posture shifted again, less rigid now, less performative, his weight moving from one foot to the other as his eyes drifted briefly toward the door and then back to Thomas Cole, as if searching for something external to explain what was happening internally. But nothing changed, the door stayed closed, the bar stayed the same, and yet everything felt different. Across the room a glass clinked against wood, a laugh started and died halfway through, conversations that had once flowed freely now circled back on themselves, quieter, uncertain, because even those not directly involved could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Something that did not belong to the ordinary rhythm of a place like this. Reyes remained still, his position deliberate now, not hiding, not intervening, just present, watching with a focus that had narrowed down to a single point, because he knew the moment was approaching, not through noise or escalation, but through absence, the absence of reaction, the absence of explanation, the absence of anything that would normally resolve a situation like this, and in that absence, something else was building, something that did not need to be announced. Briggs exhaled slowly and let out a quiet, almost humorless chuckle, rubbing his jaw as if trying to reset himself. "You ever think about explaining any of this?" he said, not mocking this time, not quite respectful either, but searching for ground that no longer seemed stable beneath him. Cole did not look up immediately, his fingers still resting against the mug, tracing the rim lightly as if the conversation was happening somewhere else entirely. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight, unchanged from before. "Explanations are for people who need to understand," he said, "not everyone does." The words settled into the space between them, not confrontational, not dismissive, just absolute, and for a moment Briggs had nothing to respond with, not because he lacked something to say, but because nothing he could say would fit into what was already there. One of the operators behind him shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious curiosity, as if he was trying to decide whether to stay part of the moment or step away from it entirely. Reyes caught that movement in his peripheral vision but did not look away from Cole, because that was where the center of gravity remained, unmoved, unshaken, and then it happened, not with a sound, not with a dramatic entrance, but with a subtle change that passed through the room like a ripple. The front door opened, the hinges barely audible under the low hum of the bar, and for a second no one paid attention, no one turned, because there was nothing to signal that this mattered, just another figure stepping inside, another shadow crossing the threshold. But Reyes felt it immediately, a shift in posture, in presence, something that did not belong to the casual movement of a late-night customer. He did not turn right away, did not break his focus, but the awareness settled into him with quiet certainty, and a few seconds later, one of the operators near the entrance went still, his conversation cutting off mid-sentence, his eyes lifting just slightly, not wide, not alarmed, but focused in a way that signaled recognition without explanation. Briggs noticed that too, just enough to glance over his shoulder, his expression tightening by a fraction as his attention split for the first time since this started, and in that small moment of distraction, the balance shifted completely, because whatever had just entered the room did not need to announce itself, did not need to command attention, it simply changed the way everything else existed around it, and Thomas Cole, without looking, without turning, lifted his coffee once more, taking a slow, measured sip as if he had been expecting this all along. The shift spread slowly, not like a shock but like a pressure drop, something subtle that pulled attention without demanding it, and one by one, the conversations nearest the entrance faded, voices lowering, bodies adjusting almost unconsciously as the figure who had stepped inside moved forward with measured, unhurried steps. There was no rush, no hesitation, just a steady presence that carried its own gravity, the kind that did not need recognition to exist but received it anyway. Briggs turned fully now, his earlier focus breaking as his eyes locked onto the man approaching. And for the first time since the moment began, uncertainty replaced control, not because he understood why, but because something in his training, something deeper than logic, responded before his mind could catch up. The man was older, not frail, not imposing in size, but composed in a way that made the space around him feel structured, deliberate, his posture straight, his movements economical, every step placed with quiet precision, and though he wore no visible insignia that demanded attention, the reaction of those who noticed him said everything that needed to be said. One operator near the bar straightened without realizing it, another fell completely silent mid-sentence, their instincts aligning before their thoughts did. Reyes finally turned his head, slow and controlled, confirming what he already knew, and the moment his eyes met the approaching figure, the last piece of doubt disappeared, his shoulders squared slightly, not in display, but in acknowledgement, because this was no coincidence. This was the answer to the call he had made without ever needing to hear it confirmed. Briggs took a half step back, subtle but unmistakable, his earlier stance dissolving into something more cautious as the man closed the distance to the table, stopping just short of it, not addressing Briggs, not acknowledging anyone else, his attention settling directly on Thomas Cole, who had not moved, had not looked up yet, as if the presence now standing before him had always been part of the moment. As if nothing had changed at all, the silence deepened, thick enough to feel, the low hum of the bar now distant, irrelevant, and when the man finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying authority not through volume but through certainty. "It has been a long time," he said. And only then did Cole lift his gaze, meeting him with the same quiet stillness, no surprise, no reaction, just recognition, the kind that did not need to be expressed. Briggs glanced between them, confusion tightening his expression as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he understood, because there was no introduction, no explanation, no rank stated. And yet the air itself had shifted into something unmistakably formal, something structured around a hierarchy he could not see. Reyes remained still, his attention fixed, because this was the moment the entire situation had been building toward, not through escalation, but through inevitability. The man's gaze did not leave Cole as he took a small step closer, just enough to close the space, and then, without raising his voice, without looking at anyone else, he spoke a single word, precise, deliberate, and unmistakable: "Reaper." The name settled into the room like a final answer, and everything stopped. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. The last fragments of conversation died without being finished, the faint movements of hands and heads froze in place, and in that silence, the weight of what had just been said began to register. Briggs felt it first as confusion, then as realization, his posture stiffening as the pieces he had dismissed moments ago aligned into something far larger than he had anticipated. Because that was not a nickname, not a casual call sign, it was something recognized, something carried, something that did not get spoken unless it meant something very specific. And Thomas Cole, still seated, still calm, gave the smallest nod, not of submission, not of acknowledgement in the usual sense, but of recognition between equals separated by time. His voice low, steady, unchanged. "General," he replied, and that single word landed heavier than anything else in the room, because it confirmed everything without explaining anything, and for the first time since this began, no one moved, no one spoke, because the moment no longer belonged to them at all. No one questioned it, no one interrupted, because the word had already done what no explanation could. It had drawn a line through the room and placed everyone on one side or the other, and the difference between those sides was not rank or age or experience, it was understanding. Briggs felt it immediately, not as knowledge but as absence, a gap where certainty used to be, his arms slowly uncrossing at his sides as the weight of what he had stepped into began to settle in, not fully formed yet, but undeniable. The general did not raise his voice, did not turn to address the others, his focus remained entirely on Thomas Cole, as if the rest of the room had ceased to exist the moment he entered it, and in that narrow space between them there was something older than protocol, something that did not require formality to carry respect. "I was not sure it was you," the general said quietly, his tone measured, controlled, but edged with something that felt close to relief, or perhaps confirmation. Cole did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and for a moment it looked as if nothing more would be said, but then his hand moved slightly, brushing once more over the worn patch, not to display it, not to hide it, just to acknowledge its presence. "That was the idea," he said, his voice even, carrying none of the tension that filled the room around him. The general gave the smallest nod, a gesture that would have gone unnoticed anywhere else, but here it landed with quiet finality. Because it was not agreement, it was recognition, the kind that closed a conversation rather than opened one. Reyes stood still, his breathing steady, but his awareness sharpened, because this was no longer a question of who the man was, that had already been answered. Now it was about what that answer meant for everyone else in the room. Briggs shifted his weight again, the movement slower this time, more deliberate, as if he was recalibrating every assumption he had made in the last few minutes, his eyes flicking once more to the patch, then back to Cole, and for the first time there was no trace of mockery in his expression, only a tightening realization that he had misread something fundamental, something he had not even known to look for. One of the operators behind him straightened fully now, his posture aligning instinctively, not in response to an order, but to presence, to the unspoken shift that had taken place. The general finally turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the others without addressing them directly, and that single movement carried more authority than any command could have. The room seemed to hold its breath in response, and when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, controlled, but unmistakably firm. "There are things that do not appear in records," he said, not as a lecture, not as a correction, but as a statement of fact, "that does not make them less real." The words settled over the operators like a quiet weight, not heavy enough to crush, but enough to anchor, enough to shift perspective in a way that could not be undone. Briggs swallowed slightly, the motion subtle but visible, his earlier confidence now replaced by something more grounded, something closer to awareness. He did not speak, did not attempt to recover the moment, because there was nothing to recover. The moment had already moved beyond him. Cole remained seated, unchanged, his presence steady as ever, and in that stillness there was no triumph, no satisfaction, just the quiet continuation of something that had never needed validation in the first place. Reyes finally allowed himself a small exhale, the tension in his chest easing just enough to confirm what he had already understood. The situation had resolved, not through confrontation, not through escalation, but through recognition, the kind that did not require explanation, only the right person at the right moment. And as the silence settled into something more stable, something less uncertain, it became clear that nothing more needed to be said, because everything that mattered had already been understood. The room did not return to normal all at once, it eased back slowly, like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had been corrected without needing to be explained. The general remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze steady on Thomas Cole, and then, with a small shift in posture, he reached for the empty chair across from him and pulled it out just enough to sit, not as a display, not as a command, but as a simple, deliberate choice, and that alone carried meaning that no one in the room missed. Briggs lowered his eyes briefly, the movement subtle but sincere, his earlier stance completely gone now, replaced by something quieter, more grounded. He did not step forward, did not speak, because he understood now that this was not his moment to recover, it was his moment to learn. Reyes remained where he was, his presence steady, no longer tense, just observant, as if committing the scene to memory, because moments like this did not come often, and when they did, they stayed with you long after they passed. Cole lifted his coffee again, taking a slow sip, the same as before, unchanged by everything that had happened around him. And when he set the mug back down, he looked at the general, not with deference, not with formality, but with the quiet acknowledgement of shared time, shared weight, things that did not need to be spoken to be understood. you did not have to come," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. The general gave a faint shake of his head, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "Some things you do not ignore," he replied, and there was no further explanation, none needed. The exchange was simple, but it carried the kind of respect that could not be manufactured, only earned. Around them, the operators began to shift again, not returning to their old rhythm, but adjusting to a new one, quieter, more aware. One by one, they straightened, not formally, not in unison, but with a shared understanding that something significant had just taken place, something that would not be spoken about loudly, but would be remembered. Briggs finally stepped back another half step, creating space not out of fear, but out of recognition, his eyes lingering for a moment on the worn patch, no longer dismissing it, no longer questioning it, just seeing it for what it was, something carried, something earned, something beyond his understanding but not beyond his respect. Cole rested his hand lightly over it once more, not protectively, not proudly, just naturally, as if it had always been there and always would be. The general rose after a moment, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural end. He gave a small nod, not to the room, not to the operators, but to Cole alone, and turned toward the door, his presence moving through the space the same way it had entered, without noise, without demand, but leaving everything slightly changed in its wake. Reyes watched him go, the weight of the moment settling fully now, not as tension, but as understanding. Briggs remained still for a second longer, then exhaled quietly, the last of his earlier confidence replaced by something more lasting, something quieter, and as the door closed softly behind the general, the bar returned to its usual sounds, the low hum of voices, the clink of glass, the turning of the fan overhead. But nothing felt quite the same anymore, because in that brief, silent moment, something had been revealed without ever being explained, and it stayed there, in the air, in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that some names are not spoken often, some stories are not told out loud, and some men do not need to prove who they are, because they already lived it.